Sandra Martinez stepped out of the transport shuttle and took her first breath of recycled air inside the Centauri Grand Station. The massive space structure stretched out before her like a glittering city floating among the stars. Curved walls of polished metal and transparent aluminum reached up toward artificial skies that showed the twin suns of Alpha Centauri burning bright in the distance. She had been traveling for 3 days to reach this place. Her back ached from the cramped shuttle seats, and her formal diplomatic uniform felt wrinkled despite her best efforts to keep it neat. But Sandra stood tall anyway. She was here representing all of humanity at the most important trade summit in decades. The future of Earth's relationship with dozens of alien worlds would be decided in the next few days. The station buzzed with activity. Tall, thin Altarians glided past on their 6 legs, their silver skin catching the artificial light. A group of stocky Rigelians argued loudly in their harsh, clicking language near a food vendor. Sandra even spotted a few of the mysterious vegans, their faces hidden behind environmental masks as always. She had studied all these species for months, learning their customs and languages. This was her chance to prove that humans belonged among the stars. Sandra made her way through the crowded corridors toward the main reception desk. Her luggage floated behind her on a repulsor cart, containing everything she would need for the week-long summit. Official documents, cultural gifts from Earth, and her formal presentation materials were all carefully packed inside. The reception area was enormous, with a high ceiling that showed a holographic display of the local star system. Behind a curved desk made of some kind of blue crystal sat a Zephyrian. Sandra recognized the species immediately from her training. They were humanoid but taller than humans, with pale green skin and large, dark eyes. This one wore the burgundy uniform of station staff. Sandra approached the desk with a smile. "Good morning," she said in perfect galactic standard. "I am Ambassador Sandra Martinez from Earth. I believe you have accommodations reserved for me." "Oh, the..." Zephyrian looked up slowly as if Sandra had interrupted something very important. His large eyes scanned her from head to toe with obvious distaste. "Earth," he said, pronouncing the word like it tasted bad. "Yes, I suppose we must have something for you people." Sandra kept her smile in place, though she felt a small knot forming in her stomach. "My reservation should be under the diplomatic housing section. I sent the paperwork weeks ago." "Paperwork," the Zephyrian repeated with a snort. He began tapping at a holographic display with long, pale fingers. "You humans and your endless paperwork. Always so concerned with your little rules and procedures." Comment stung. But Sandra had dealt with prejudice before. Not all species welcomed humanity into the galactic community. Some saw humans as newcomers who had advanced too quickly, while others viewed them as primitive barbarians barely worthy of notice. "I understand processing can take time," Sandra said politely. "I appreciate your patience." The Zephyrian's name tag-read Klextar in both Galactic Standard and Zephyrian script. He continued searching through his system, muttering complaints under his breath. Other beings waiting in line behind Sandra began to shift impatiently. "Ah, here we are." "Klextar," finally said Sandra Martinez. He pronounced each syllable of her name wrong, making it sound clumsy and foreign. "Human diplomatic representative. 3rd-class accommodation." Sandra's smile faltered. "I'm sorry, there must be a mistake. My documentation clearly states I should have 1st-class diplomatic quarters. I'm here as Earth's primary ambassador." Klextar's large eyes narrowed. "I see what we have available for your kind. Perhaps you are not familiar with how things work here. This is the Centauri Grand Station, not some human outpost. We maintain certain standards." Heat rose in Sandra's cheeks, but she forced herself to remain calm. Around them, other species had begun to notice the conversation. She could feel their eyes watching, judging. "I understand your standards are very high," Sandra said carefully. "That's exactly why Earth chose this station for such an important summit. However, I do need to insist on the accommodations that were arranged. This is a matter of diplomatic protocol." Klextar leaned back in his chair and looked at Sandra as if she were a child throwing a tantrum. "Diplomatic protocol," he repeated, with amusement. How long has your species been part of the galactic community? 50 years? 60? Some of us have been traveling between stars for thousands of years. A group of Altarians had stopped to watch the exchange. One of them whispered something to another, and Sandra caught the word human followed by what sounded like laughter. Your species may be young, Sandra replied, keeping her voice steady, but we are here legitimately and with proper credentials. I would like to speak with your supervisor if there's a problem with my reservation. Supervisor, Klextar said, dragging out the word. You think running to authority figures will solve your problems? How very human. He tapped his screen a few more times. I suppose I can find you something. Level C, Section 7, Room 247. That should be adequate for someone of your background. Sandra knew from her research that Level C was the lowest guest level on the station, barely above crew quarters. It was nowhere near the diplomatic sector where she was supposed to be staying. But arguing further would only make the scene worse. Thank you, she said through gritted teeth. I'll take what's available. Klextar handed her a small device that would serve as her room key and identification badge. As she reached for it, he pulled it back slightly, making her stretch to grab. A word of advice, and he said with fake concern. The other delegates here are from very old, very civilized cultures. Perhaps it would be best if you kept to yourself. We wouldn't want any misunderstandings. Sandra took the device and straightened up. She could feel the stares of dozens of beings around her. Some seemed curious, others amused. A few looked embarrassed by what they had witnessed. I'll be sure to remember that, Sandra said. She gathered her luggage and walked away from the desk with as much dignity as she could manage. As she waited for the transport tube to her floor, Sandra tried to push down her anger and embarrassment. This was just the beginning. She had a job to do, and she wouldn't let one rude receptionist stop her from representing her species with honor. But deep down, she wondered if this was a sign of what the rest of the summit would be like. Sandra's room was exactly as bad as she had expected. The walls were bare metal, and the single window looked out at the station's waste processing units. The bed was narrow and hard, nothing like the comfortable quarters she should have received as a diplomatic representative. She unpacked her belongings anyway, hanging her formal dress uniforms in the tiny closet. After settling in, Sandra decided to explore the station and find the conference areas where the summit would take place. She had studied the station maps, but seeing everything in person would help her prepare. The diplomatic sector was on Level A, far above her current location. The transport tube carried her up through the station's levels. As she rose higher, the corridors became wider and more elegant. Expensive artwork from dozens of worlds decorated the walls. The lighting was softer and warmer. This was clearly where the important guests stayed. Sandra found the main conference hall without much trouble. It was a beautiful room with a domed ceiling that showed a real-time view of space around the station. Hundreds of seats were arranged in a circle, with translation equipment at each position. Tomorrow, this room would be filled with representatives from across the galaxy. Excuse me, said a voice behind her. Sandra turned to see a human man in a military uniform. He looked to be in his 30s with short brown hair and tired eyes. I'm Lieutenant Jake Morrison, he said, extending his hand. I'm assigned as your aide for the summit. I just arrived this morning. Sandra shook his hand, gratefully. It felt good to see another human face after her unpleasant encounter at reception. Sandra Martinez, she replied. I'm glad you're here, Jake. I have a feeling I'm going to need all the help I can get. Jake frowned. Is something wrong? You look upset. Sandra told him about her treatment at the front desk and her terrible room assignment. Jake's expression grew darker as she spoke. That's completely unacceptable, he said when she finished. You're a legitimate ambassador with proper credentials. I should file a complaint with station management. Let's wait and see how things develop, Sandra said. I don't want to cause more problems before the summit even begins. They spent the next hour walking through the diplomatic areas. Jake showed Sandra the various meeting rooms, dining halls, and lounges where informal negotiations would take place. Everything was designed to impress, with beautiful furnishings and spectacular views of space. As they explored, Sandra noticed other delegates arriving and settling in. She recognized several species from her studies. The Rigelian delegation looked impressive in their ceremonial armor. A group of Altarians glided past, speaking in their musical language. Everyone seemed comfortable and confident in these elegant surroundings. When it came time for lunch, Sandra and Jake made their way to the main diplomatic dining hall. It was a large room with tables arranged to accommodate different species and their unique dietary needs. The smell of food from dozens of worlds filled the air. Sandra approached the entrance where a tall Zephyrian in a server's uniform stood checking guest credentials. It wasn't Klextar from the front desk, but another member of the same species. "Good afternoon," Sandra said politely. "I'm Ambassador Martinez from Earth. I'd like a table for 2, please." The server looked at Sandra's identification badge and frowned. "I'm sorry, but this dining hall is reserved for first-class diplomatic guests only. Your badge shows you're in third-class accommodations." Sandra felt her face grow hot. "There's been a mistake with my room assignment. I'm here as Earth's primary representative to the summit. All my paperwork was filed correctly. I can only go by what the system shows," the server said with fake sympathy. "Perhaps you could try the general cafeteria on level D. I'm sure they have food suitable for your needs." Jake stepped forward, his jaw tight with anger. "This is ridiculous. She has every right to eat here." The server's expression grew cold. "Are you questioning station policy? I could call security if you're going to cause trouble." By now, other delegates in the dining hall had begun to notice the commotion. Sandra could see them whispering to each other and pointing in her direction. A group of Rigelians at a nearby table were clearly enjoying the show. "No trouble necessary," Sandra said quickly, grabbing Jake's arm before he could say anything else. "We'll find somewhere else to eat." As they walked away, Sandra heard laughter from behind them. One of the Rigelians said something in his own language, but Sandra caught the word for primitive in Galactic Standard. They found the general cafeteria on level D, which was crowded with station workers and lower-level staff. The food was basic but edible. Sandra tried to eat, but her appetite was gone. "This is getting worse," Jake said quietly. "First the room. Now they won't even let you eat with the other ambassadors. Something's not right here." Sandra pushed food around on her plate. "Maybe I'm not cut out for this. Maybe humans really don't belong among these ancient civilizations." "Don't say that," Jake replied firmly. "You earned your position. Earth chose you because you're the best diplomat we have. Don't let these bullies make you doubt yourself." After lunch, they tried to visit the diplomatic lounge where informal meetings were supposed to take place. Once again, Sandra was turned away because of her third-class status. The same thing happened when she tried to access the station's library and research facilities. By evening, Sandra felt completely shut out from the summit activities. Other delegates were already forming alliances and discussing trade deals in spaces she couldn't access. She was trapped in the lower levels of the station, while the real business happened far above her. The final insult came that evening. Sandra had received an invitation to a pre-summit dinner where delegates would meet informally before the official sessions began. She put on her best dress uniform and made her way to the elegant dining room on level A. Klextar was stationed at the entrance checking invitations. When Sandra approached, his large eyes lit up with cruel amusement. "Well, well," he said loudly enough for others to hear. "The human ambassador. Let me see your invitation." Sandra handed him the official document. Klextar examined it carefully, taking much longer than necessary. "I'm sorry," he finally announced, "but this invitation appears to be irregular. I cannot allow you entry to this exclusive event." "Irregular how?" Sandra asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "The formatting is all wrong. Very sloppy work. Clearly not up to our standards." Klextar handed the invitation back to her. "Perhaps next time you'll be more careful with your paperwork." Sandra looked at the invitation. It was identical to the others she had received, printed on official station letterhead. There was nothing wrong with it at all. Other delegates were watching now, some with curiosity, others with barely hidden amusement. Sandra felt humiliated and alone, standing there in her formal uniform while being turned away from an event where she belonged. She turned and walked away without another word, Jake following behind her. As they left, she heard more laughter and whispered comments about typical human incompetence. Back in her small room, Sandra sat on the narrow bed and wondered if she should just give up and go home. Sandra sat in her small room, staring out the window at the waste processing units. Tomorrow the summit would begin and she felt completely unprepared. She had been cut off from all the informal meetings where real negotiations happened. Other ambassadors had spent the day building relationships while she was stuck eating in the staff cafeteria. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Sandra opened it to find Jake standing in the hallway, but he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a man Sandra recognized immediately, even though she hadn't seen him in years. Commander Ryan Stone looked older than she remembered. His dark hair was now streaked with gray and new lines marked his weathered face. But his blue eyes were as sharp as ever, and he carried himself with the same quiet confidence that had made him famous across the galaxy. "Hello, Sandra," Ryan said with a gentle smile. "Mind if we come in?" Sandra stepped back in shock. "Ryan, what are you doing here? I thought you were stationed at the Mars defense grid." "I was," Ryan replied, entering the cramped room. "But I got special permission to attend the summit as an observer. I wanted to see how humanity's first major trade negotiations would go." Jake followed them inside and closed the door. "I sent a message to Commander Stone when I saw what was happening to you," he explained. "I thought he should know." Ryan looked around the tiny room with its bare walls and narrow bed. His expression grew serious. "This is where they put Earth's ambassador? I've seen better accommodations in military prison cells." Sandra felt embarrassed about the room but also relieved to see an old friend. She had known Ryan since their academy days, before he became one of the most respected military officers in human space. "It's not ideal," she admitted, "but I'm managing." "Tell him everything," Jake urged. "Tell him about the dining hall, the lounge, the dinner tonight." Sandra hesitated. She didn't want to sound like she was complaining, but Ryan's steady gaze encouraged her to speak. She explained everything that had happened since her arrival, the deliberate mispronunciation of her name, the third-class room assignment being banned from diplomatic facilities, and finally, the humiliation at tonight's dinner. Ryan listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each detail. When Sandra finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Klextar," he said finally. "That's the receptionist's name?" "Yes. Do you know him?" Ryan shook his head. "Not personally, but I know his species well. I fought alongside Zephyrian forces during the Outer Rim conflicts." Sandra had heard stories about those conflicts, though. The details were often classified. Several alien colonies had been attacked by raiders and human forces had been sent to help defend them. Ryan had commanded one of the relief fleets. "The Zephyrians are proud people," Ryan continued. "Sometimes that pride makes them blind to reality. They have long memories, but they also have strong concepts of honor and debt." Jake leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Ryan stood up and walked to the small window. Outside, the twin suns of Alpha Centauri were setting, casting long shadows across the station's hull. "During the war, human forces saved dozens of worlds," he said quietly. "We didn't ask for payment or territory. We just helped because it was the right thing to do. A lot of species owe their continued existence to human sacrifice." Sandra remembered reading about the casualty reports from those conflicts. Thousands of human soldiers had died defending alien worlds. The losses had been heavy, but humanity had kept fighting anyway. "The problem," Ryan said, turning back to them, "is that some species find it hard to accept help from others, especially from a young species like humanity. It makes them feel weak or inferior." "So they treat us badly to make themselves feel better?" Jake asked. "Something like that. They convince themselves that humans are primitive or barbaric. It's easier than admitting they needed our help." Sandra felt a spark of anger. "So I'm being punished because we helped them?" "In a way, yes. But that's going to change." Ryan's voice was calm, but Sandra could hear steel beneath it. "I didn't come here just to visit. I have some business to attend to." What kind of business? Sandra asked. Ryan smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. The kind that reminds people about history, the kind that makes them remember why showing respect matters. He moved toward the door, then paused. Get some rest, Sandra. Tomorrow is going to be a very different day than today. After Ryan left, Sandra felt confused but hopeful. She had seen that look in his eyes before, back during their academy days when someone made the mistake of underestimating him. Ryan Stone was not the kind of man who made threats. He simply acted when action was needed. Jake seemed excited. Do you know what he's planning? No, Sandra replied. But I know Ryan. He doesn't do anything without careful thought. And he never makes promises he can't keep. Later that evening, Sandra heard rumors spreading through the lower levels of the station. Someone important had arrived, someone whose reputation preceded him across the galaxy. Station workers whispered about a human military commander who had once saved an entire star system from destruction. The rumors reached the upper levels too. Sandra learned this when her door chimed late that night. She opened it to find a nervous-looking Altarian in diplomatic robes. Ambassador Martinez, the alien said in careful galactic standard. I am Deputy Ambassador Veltar from the Altarian delegation. I wanted to... That is, we heard that Commander Stone has arrived. Sandra nodded. He's here as an observer. Yes, of course. An observer? Veltar's 6 legs shifted nervously. I simply wanted to say that the Altarian delegation has great respect for both Commander Stone and for Earth's contributions to galactic peace. It was a carefully neutral statement, but Sandra could hear the real message underneath. Word was spreading that a human war hero was on the station, and suddenly people were remembering that maybe humans weren't so primitive after all. After the Altarian left, Sandra allowed herself to smile for the first time since arriving at the station. She still didn't know what Ryan was planning, but clearly his mere presence was already making waves. She went to bed that night with a feeling she hadn't had in days. Hope. Tomorrow would indeed be different. Ryan Stone had a way of making sure things turned out right even when the odds seemed impossible. Outside her window, the stars of Alpha Centauri burned bright in the darkness, and somewhere on the station, a legend was preparing to remind the galaxy what humanity was really capable of. The next morning, Sandra woke up feeling more hopeful than she had since arriving at the station. She put on her best diplomatic uniform and made her way to the main conference hall, where the summit would officially begin. Today, she would finally get to do the job she came here for. The conference hall was impressive in the morning light. Delegates from dozens of worlds had gathered, their various forms of clothing and equipment creating a colorful display. Sandra found her assigned seat in the human section and noticed that other delegates were glancing at her more often than before. The opening ceremonies went smoothly. Each delegation was introduced and welcomed to the summit. When Earth's turn came, Sandra stood proudly as her credentials were read aloud. She caught sight of Klexitar near the back of the room, watching with his usual expression of disdain. During the first break, Sandra mingled with other delegates as best she could. Some were polite but distant. Others seemed more curious about her than they had been yesterday. She noticed that several kept mentioning Commander Stone in their conversations, though none spoke to her directly about him. It was during the second session that things began to change in unexpected ways. Sandra was listening to a presentation about trade route security when she noticed Ryan enter the hall quietly. He wore his formal military uniform with its various medals and ribbons. Even from across the room, his presence seemed to command attention. Ryan didn't take a seat with the observers. Instead, he moved slowly through the hall, stopping to speak quietly with various delegates. Sandra watched as he approached the Regelian delegation first. The stocky warriors who had laughed at her yesterday now listened intently as Ryan spoke to them in their own language. Next, Ryan visited the Altarian section. The tall, silver-skinned beings seemed especially respectful, bowing their heads as he passed. One of them gestured toward Sandra, and Ryan nodded seriously. As the session continued, Sandra began to notice whispered conversations spreading throughout the hall. Delegates would lean toward each other, speaking in low voices while glancing, between Ryan and Sandra. Something was happening, but she couldn't tell exactly what. During lunch break, Sandra decided to eat in the general cafeteria again, rather than face another humiliation at the diplomatic dining hall. To her surprise, Jake was waiting for her with news. "Commander Stone has been busy this morning," Jake said as they found a table. "He's been having private conversations with almost every major delegation." "About what?" Sandra asked. "I'm not sure exactly, but I heard some interesting things. He's been reminding people about recent history, specifically about human contributions to galactic security and peace." Sandra raised an eyebrow. "What kind of contributions?" Jake pulled out a small data pad and showed it to her. "I did some research after he arrived yesterday. Did you know that human medical teams saved over 3 million Altarian lives during the plague outbreak 5 years ago? We provided vaccines and treatments for free." Sandra had heard about the plague, but she hadn't known the full extent of human involvement. "And this," Jake continued, scrolling through more information. "Human Engineering Corps spent 2 years rebuilding the Vegan trade networks after the asteroid collision. They refused any payment and worked in dangerous conditions to restore commerce for that entire sector." The list went on. Human peacekeepers had ended civil wars. Human scientists had shared agricultural advances that ended famines. Human rescue teams had evacuated entire planets during natural disasters. In almost every case, humanity had helped without asking for anything in return. "Ryan is reminding them of all this?" Sandra asked. "That's what it looks like. And from what I can tell, a lot of delegates are starting to feel uncomfortable about how you've been treated." As if to prove Jake's point, Sandra noticed that other beings in the cafeteria were looking at her differently than before. Instead of dismissive glances, she saw curiosity and even what might have been respect. After lunch, the afternoon session took an interesting turn. When delegates returned to the conference hall, Sandra noticed that several had changed their attitudes toward her completely. The Altarian deputy ambassador who had visited her room the night before made a point of greeting her warmly. Even some of the Rigelians nodded respectfully in her direction, but the most dramatic change came from an unexpected source. During a discussion about humanitarian aid policies, one of the Zephyrian delegates stood up to speak. "I would like to acknowledge," the tall, green-skinned being said clearly, "that this summit has benefited greatly from the presence of species who understand the true meaning of selfless service. The Zephyrian Republic has not forgotten those who have aided us in times of need." The comment was clearly directed at the human delegation, and Sandra felt a warm glow of pride. Other delegates began to murmur agreement, and several more stood to make similar statements about human assistance to their worlds. Klextar, still standing near the back of the room, looked increasingly uncomfortable as the praise continued. His usual arrogant expression had been replaced by something that looked almost like shame. During the final break of the day, Sandra was approached by more delegates than she had spoken to since arriving. They wanted to discuss trade agreements, cultural exchanges, and joint scientific projects. For the first time, she felt like she was actually doing her job as an ambassador. As the day's sessions ended, Sandra saw Ryan speaking with a group of senior delegates near the main entrance. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language suggested serious conversation. Several of them glanced toward Klextar, who was trying to make himself invisible behind a support pillar. That evening, Sandra decided to try visiting the diplomatic lounge again. She expected to be turned away as usual, but the server at the entrance surprised her by checking her credentials quickly and waving her through without comment. Inside the elegant lounge, Sandra found herself welcomed by delegates who had ignored her completely the day before. The Altarian deputy ambassador bought her a drink and apologized for not speaking with her sooner. A Rigelian trade representative wanted to discuss mineral rights in human space. As the evening progressed, Sandra realized that Ryan's quiet campaign was working perfectly. He hadn't confronted anyone directly or made any demands. Instead, he had simply reminded people of facts they had chosen to forget or ignore. The galaxy owed humanity debts that couldn't be repaid, and those debts came with a certain amount of respect. When Sandra finally returned to her room that night, she found a message waiting for her. It was from station management, informing her that a mistake had been found in her accommodation assignment. A proper diplomatic suite would be available for her the next morning. She smiled as she read the message. Ryan hadn't just reminded the delegates about human contributions to the galaxy. He had reminded everyone, including the station staff, that treating Earth's ambassador with disrespect was no longer acceptable. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but Sandra felt ready to face them. She was no longer alone and isolated. She was a representative of a species that had earned its place among the stars through courage, sacrifice, and compassion. And everyone on the station was finally beginning to remember that. Sandra woke up in her new diplomatic suite feeling like a different person. The spacious room had a beautiful view of the Alpha Centauri system, comfortable furniture, and all the amenities she should have received from the beginning. More importantly, the change in her accommodations meant that the station management was finally taking her seriously. She dressed carefully in her finest diplomatic uniform and made her way to the main conference hall. Today was the most important day of the summit, when major trade agreements would be discussed and voted on. Sandra had prepared for months to represent Earth's interests in these negotiations. The morning session went better than Sandra had dared to hope. Delegates who had ignored her completely just 2 days ago now sought her opinions on various proposals. The Altarian delegation invited Earth to join a new scientific research project. The Rigelians expressed interest in purchasing human-made medical equipment, but Sandra could sense tension building in the room. Ryan had been making more rounds, speaking quietly with different groups. His conversations seemed more serious today, and several delegates looked troubled after talking with him. During the lunch break, Sandra was finally able to eat in the diplomatic dining hall without any problems. The same server who had turned her away before now seated her at one of the best tables without comment. As she ate, she noticed groups of delegates having intense discussions at nearby tables. It was during the afternoon session that everything came to a head. The conference had reached the point where delegates would make formal statements about their positions on the proposed trade agreements. Each species would have a chance to address the entire assembly. Sandra was scheduled to speak for Earth. Near the end of the session, she had prepared a carefully worded speech about humanity's desire for peaceful cooperation and mutual benefit. But as she listened to other delegates speak, she realized that something bigger was happening. Several alien representatives made pointed comments about the importance of treating all species with respect, regardless of how recently they had joined the galactic community. The Altarian ambassador spoke about the value of judging species by their actions rather than their age. The Rigelian trade minister mentioned that true strength came from helping others, not from putting them down. Sandra began to understand that Ryan's campaign was reaching its climax. He was preparing the ground for something significant, but she still wasn't sure exactly what. Then Ryan himself stood up from the observer section. "Honored delegates," he said in a voice that carried easily through the large hall, "I request permission to address this assembly." The conference moderator, an elderly Vegan diplomat, looked surprised. "Commander Stone, observers are not typically permitted to speak during formal sessions." "I understand the protocol," Ryan replied calmly. "But I have information that is directly relevant to the discussions taking place today. Information that I believe this assembly needs to hear." Murmurs spread through the hall. Several delegates began speaking to each other in urgent whispers. Sandra could see Klexitar near the back of the room, looking more nervous than she had ever seen him. The moderator consulted with other senior delegates for a moment, then nodded. "Very well, Commander Stone. The assembly will hear what you have to say." Ryan walked slowly to the speaker's platform at the center of the hall. He stood there for a moment, looking around at the assembled delegates from dozens of worlds. When he began to speak, his voice was calm but powerful. "Honored representatives," he said, "I come before you today not as a military officer, but as someone who has witnessed the best and worst of what our galaxy has to offer. I have seen species work together to achieve great things, and I have seen them tear each other apart over pride and prejudice." He paused, letting his words sink in. The hall was completely silent. Over the past 2 days, I have had the privilege of speaking with many of you about recent history, about times when our species have helped each other in moments of crisis, about the bonds that should unite us as inhabitants of the same galaxy. Sandra felt her heart racing. She could sense that Ryan was building toward something important, but she still didn't know what it would be. I have been reminded, Ryan continued, of the human medical teams who saved millions of Altarian lives during the plague outbreak, of the human engineers who rebuilt the Vegan trade networks after the asteroid disaster, of the human peacekeepers who ended the civil war in the Rigel system at the cost of thousands of our own lives. More murmurs spread through the assembly. Several delegates were nodding in agreement. But there is one story I have not yet shared, Ryan said, his voice growing stronger, a story that I believe is particularly relevant to our discussions about respect and cooperation. He turned slightly, and Sandra realized with shock that he was looking directly at the Zephyrian delegation. 3 years ago, Ryan said clearly, the Zephyrian homeworld faced a catastrophe that threatened to destroy their entire civilization. Solar flares from their sun had disrupted their planetary defense grid, leaving them vulnerable to the worst natural disaster in their recorded history. Sandra saw several Zephyrians in the audience shift uncomfortably. Klextar had gone completely pale. The Zephyrian government sent out desperate calls for assistance to every member of the galactic community, Ryan continued. Most species were unable to help due to the extreme danger involved. The rescue operation would require ships and crews willing to fly directly through solar radiation that could kill them. The hall was so quiet that Sandra could hear her own heartbeat. But one species answered that call without hesitation, Ryan said. Human rescue fleets, led by a single brave volunteer, launched immediately for the Zephyrian system. They flew, through radiation storms that destroyed half their ships. They landed on a world that was literally burning around them. Sandra felt tears forming in her eyes as she began to understand what Ryan was revealing. That volunteer coordinator personally directed the evacuation of over 2 million Zephyrian refugees, Ryan said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. She organized food distribution, medical care, and temporary housing for beings whose world was dying around them. She worked for 6 days straight without sleep, saving as many lives as she could. Ryan turned to look directly at Sandra, and she felt the eyes of the entire assembly follow his gaze. That volunteer was Ambassador Sandra Martinez, he said simply, the same woman who has been treated with disrespect and contempt since arriving at this station. The same woman whose courage and compassion saved the lives of millions of beings who now question her right to sit among them as an equal. The silence that followed was deafening. Sandra could see shock and shame on faces throughout the hall. The Zephyrian delegates looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor, but the most dramatic reaction came from Klextar himself. The receptionist who had made Sandra's life miserable for the past 3 days was staring at her with an expression of complete horror, as if he had just realized he had been insulting his own savior. Ryan's voice broke the silence one final time. I ask you, honored delegates, is this how we treat the heroes who risk everything to save us? The silence in the conference hall stretched on for what felt like forever. Sandra could feel hundreds of eyes staring at her, but she kept her gaze fixed on Ryan. She had never expected him to reveal the details of the Zephyrian rescue mission. Those records had been classified to protect the survivors' privacy. Finally, the silence was broken by a sound Sandra had not expected. Someone was crying. She turned to see that it was coming from the Zephyrian delegation. One of the older ambassadors had tears streaming down his pale green face. Ambassador Martinez, the Zephyrian elder said, standing slowly on shaking legs. I was there. I was one of the refugees you saved from the burning cities of our homeworld. More Zephyrians began to stand, and Sandra realized with amazement that several of them had tears in their large dark eyes. The elder continued speaking, his voice breaking with emotion. You carried my granddaughter to safety when the evacuation ships were full. You gave her your own food rations when supplies ran low. You stayed behind to help load the final transport even though the radiation was killing your equipment. Other Zephyrians began to speak up, sharing their own memories of the rescue. Sandra remembered some of their faces now. though they looked different in their formal diplomatic clothing than they had as desperate refugees 3 years ago. She organized medical stations in the refugee camps, another Zephyrian said. She worked with no sleep for days to make sure everyone had shelter. She learned our language in just 2 days so she could speak directly to the children who were too scared to talk to the translators, added a female Zephyrian diplomat. Sandra felt overwhelmed by the memories flooding back. She had tried not to think about those 6 horrible days too often. The images of a dying world and terrified families still gave her nightmares sometimes. But the most dramatic reaction came from the back of the hall. Klextar, the receptionist who had treated her so badly, was pushing through the crowd of delegates. His face was white with shock and shame. "Ambassador Martinez," he called out as he reached the front of the hall. "Please, I must speak." The entire assembly turned to watch as Klextar dropped to his knees in front of Sandra's seat. The proud, arrogant being who had humiliated her for 3 days was now trembling with emotion. "My family," he said in a broken voice. "My mate and our 3 children. You saved them all. You pulled them from the burning ruins of our city when the rescue ships had already left. You carried my youngest son in your own arms to the medical station." Sandra stared at him in amazement. She remembered that day clearly now. A Zephyrian father had been trapped under fallen debris while his family waited nearby. Sandra and her team had worked for hours to free him, even though their radiation exposure was already dangerous. "I didn't know," Klextar continued, tears flowing freely down his face. "When I saw your name on the registration list, I didn't make the connection. I only knew you as the human who had saved my world, not as the ambassador arriving for the summit." He looked up at Sandra with desperate eyes. "How could I have treated you so badly? How could I have been so blind? You are the reason my children are alive today, and I repaid your kindness with cruelty and disrespect." Sandra felt her own tears starting to fall. She stood up and placed a gentle hand on Klextar's shoulder. "You don't need to kneel," she said softly. "Please, stand up." Klextar rose slowly, still shaking with emotion. "I have no excuse for my behavior. I was jealous of humanity's rapid rise in the galaxy. I felt that my own species was being forgotten while younger civilizations received attention and respect." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I thought that by treating you badly I could somehow prove that Zephyrians were still important. But all I proved was that I had forgotten the most important lesson my people learned from the disaster, that true strength comes from helping others, not from putting them down." The hall erupted in murmurs of agreement and sympathy. Sandra could see that many delegates were moved by Klextar's confession and apology. "I accept your apology," Sandra said clearly, so the entire assembly could hear. "We all make mistakes when we let pride cloud our judgment. What matters is that we learn from them." Klextar nodded gratefully, then made a formal bow that showed deep respect. "I resign my position at this station immediately. I do not deserve to serve in a place that hosts beings as noble as yourself." "That's not necessary," Sandra replied, quickly. "Everyone deserves a second chance to do better." The conference moderator stood up, clearly moved by what he had witnessed. "I believe," he said in his wise old voice, "that we have all learned something important today about the true meaning of galactic citizenship." One by one, delegates from across the assembly began to stand and applaud. The sound grew louder and louder until the entire hall was filled with thunderous clapping that seemed to go on forever. When the applause finally died down, the business of the summit continued. But everything had changed. Sandra found herself at the center of every important discussion. Trade agreements that had seemed impossible before were suddenly within reach. Species that had been suspicious of humanity now competed to offer partnership deals. The Zephyrian delegation formally invited Earth to establish a permanent embassy on their homeworld. The Altarians offered to share their advanced medical technology freely with human colonies. Even the proud Regalians proposed a mutual defense treaty that would have been unthinkable just days before. As the summit concluded that evening, Sandra realized that something much more important than trade deals had been accomplished. The Galaxy had been reminded that true strength didn't come from age or technology or military power. It came from the willingness to help others, even when there was nothing to gain from it. Ryan found her after the final session ended. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. "You handled that perfectly." "You didn't have to reveal the rescue mission," Sandra replied. "Those records were classified." "Some things are too important to keep secret," Ryan said with a smile. The galaxy needed to remember what humanity is really about. Not our weapons or our ships, but our willingness to risk everything for people we've never met. That night, Sandra stood in her proper diplomatic suite, looking out at the stars of Alpha Centauri. She thought about all the species represented at the summit, and how they had come together despite their differences. Humanity had earned its place among the stars not through conquest or intimidation, but through courage, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to doing what was right. And now finally, the rest of the galaxy was beginning to understand that. The future looked brighter than ever, and Sandra couldn't wait to see what humanity would accomplish next.